Well, good evening, and thank you very much for coming out on a special edition of our Steel Center lectures for Friday evening. That's giving of yourselves. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And Hendrix, the Steel Center for Philosophy and Religion, is a sponsor of tonight's talk by Dr. Miroslav Volf from Yale Divinity School. He is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology, and he's also the founder and director of the Yale Center for Culture and Faith and Culture. He has authored over 20 books. I brought 2 with me. Exclusion and Embrace is all about what it means to exclude people and what it means to embrace them. And then a book, Allah, on is Allah the same God as the Christian God? And he's done a lot of work in working with people of different religious faiths, and particularly on the issue of religion, the public good. His 2016 book is called Flourishing: Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. So we're delighted to have you talk about these kinds of issues, and we'll have some time for questions and comments afterwards, and then we'll have a reception. But please welcome Dr. Volf.
Good evening, friends. I'm delighted to be able to be here with you in Hendrix College, my first time here, and I am duly impressed. I've had conversations with three distinct groups of folks, and all immensely not just pleasant, because I expected you folks might be, but also very enlightening for me personally. So I'm delighted to have been here. So my topic for today and also tomorrow, I will continue in the same direction, is the question of what one might describe the true life in the context of social pluralism within the given social political order. And I'll talk more about how does one negotiate truth claims than anything else, but it will be centered around the question of the true life, or the question of flourishing life, the question of the good life, the question of life that is worth living, the question of meaningful life. There are many different ways in which a set of issues can be named. And each of these terms, whether it's a good life or a flourishing life or true life, has their own, all of these terms have their own histories and their own particular intellectual locations. For my purposes tonight, I can leave those aside and suggest that those refer to roughly the same set of issues. And what I am above all interested in exploring, and in some ways I think also retrieving, well, not in some ways, clearly retrieving at the center of our discussion, it is the question of what are the ultimate goals of our lives, or how do we express the kind of entirety, or how do we approach the question of the entirety of the set of values, or table of values, to use the phrase of Friedrich Nietzsche. Or you can put it relatively simply, what is truly worth wanting? We have multiple desires, and we tend to follow those desires. We weigh them in terms of what is desirable, but what are ultimate criteria by which we determine what is desirable as we go along the way, choosing our life, choosing how to live our lives. This is a topic, though, of discussion. I think that the great and small religious traditions have all had at the center of their interest this very question. Now, religions are many different things, and when I speak even about religions, I realize that that's a controversial term to use at all. There's no such a thing as religion, sometimes we are told. Let's stipulate I'm using the word religion more in the colloquial sense of that term. And what we generally refer to as religions, they are about many things, but they are also fundamentally about the question of the directionality of our lives. What is, in the most profound sense, desirable, and what shapes and forms ought to shape and ought to form all of the other of our desires and all of the other of our doings. In many ways, I think we can say that that's what great philosophies also philosophers are about, and one can list the range of them, very diverse ones, all the way. So it starts with Socrates, and we can end with Nietzsche. And Nietzsche has, in one of his last books, he was just on the verge of going, of not being quite fully sane, let's put it this way, in a charitable way, when he wrote his book Antichrist. But nonetheless, it expresses in maybe a very powerful and a vivid way what he was after. And one of the things that it says at the very beginning of it is that he is, and his entire project is what kind of human being should we desire or should we try to breed? That's his term. Let's use a slightly different term than breeding there, right? It's not quite as appropriate as it might be for cattle, for humans, but the basic idea is what is the shape of humanity that we should have? I think this is a fundamental question that we need to take up. Now, not all people agree that this is the fundamental question. Some, in fact, when I speak about these issues, some in fact suggest that this is a kind of a luxury question. That's a question for folks whose stomachs are not growling. That's the kind of question for middle class students in nice little places like Hendrix College to entertain their thoughts, but they're not really kind of existentially fundamental questions for us. And generally my response to that question is, it may be that we are underestimating the depth and level of interest in humanity among the people who don't have as much as we do. Often I try to illustrate things that I'm talking about with stories, but the story that my mother always told me many times is that she comes from very poor, she came from very poor circumstances. She had to get up every morning at 4 o'clock to take their one cow to the pasture because before she would go to school. That was a kind of tough kind of job, and she did it since she was a six-year-old little girl. At 7, she recalls, walking to her grandmother's place through the woods and raising the question, who am I? How am I supposed to be and live? That's a 7-year-old girl who's asking this question, and it's the same question or same version of the question appropriate to the intellectual capacity that a philosopher might ask as well. We as human beings are oriented to the ultimate good, I believe, whether we are aware of it or not, and we think of our lives also not just as lived in a particular moment, but also lived across the times, and we ask the question not just what's good for me here and now at this particular moment, but what it means for me to actually grow in something like my own human fullness. So some people, as I said, say this is a kind of luxury question, and my response is no, actually, this is a fundamental question. And in fact, this question was most compellingly addressed in the great religious traditions, number of whose founders were, according to the measure of our standard, living rather impoverished lives. Think of the life of Jesus. Most of us would think this is just below the level of poverty. I mean, most of us would be for government subsidies for folks like Jesus around, because he obviously did not have any kind of, nearly any kind of luxuries of the type that even some of the most poorest among us have. By the way, this is in no way argument not to help those who are impoverished, right? Don't read it that way. It's simply to say people at various economic levels, I think, can and do ask those questions, as we see all around the world. The other objection that can be made is this is it may be a fundamental question, but given the state of affairs in the world today, this has to be somehow a marginal question. Just think about an issue that concerns me a great deal and exercises me a great deal, this growing inequality in the world today. This is, I mean, from my perspective, it's absolutely scandalous how we have managed to organize our economy in such a way that we seem to take it as a normal course of events, that there are these absolutely staggering discrepancies in wealth distribution. Or the other issue that exercises me quite a bit, and that's the ecological devastation that's taking place as we speak. And it's not quite clear that the life as we are leading it is sustainable, certainly not over the long haul. Questions of this sort could be seen as much more important, and therefore that we ought to spend our energies addressing those. Again, without detracting of importance of these kinds of questions, I do believe that none of these kinds of questions actually cannot be properly addressed unless we have thematized what it is and where it is that we are heading and what are our ultimate value. I think both what we are doing to our environment and this inequality are expression of particular implicit understanding of what the good life is, and it's this conception of the good life itself that has to be called into question, and not just the functioning of the larger system that pushes us in that direction. So I believe it's not a luxury question, it's not a marginal question, it is the fundamental question of our lives. And I think that today, in the context of modernity, and my title of the lecture does have a word modernity, so I'll pick that up right now at this moment. This is a very much a pressing question. It used to be in traditional societies that people lived in an environments in which kind of questions of how to live one life and question of good life was almost embedded in a larger social order, and sometimes even in a cosmic order, so that it needed not to become a specific question of pursuit that I engage in, because the givens were there, and unless I rebelled, I was carried on with a vision, certain vision of the good life. To a certain extent, that's happening also now. We operate with tacit visions, and yet at the same time we live under the condition of modernity in which we have multiple choices. And it's not just that we have multiple choices. We are condemned to choose. We're given opportunity to choose, but we also choose inescapably. In that sense, we're condemned to choice. Some years back, some decades back, Peter Berger, a sociologist, has spoken of the so-called, has a book entitled Heretical Imperative. And he uses intentionally the word heretical, meaning that, in the sense of that heresy is a particular choice to go in a particular direction. He means a choice, inescapable choice society, so that even if we have been nurtured in a particular tradition, we always, sooner or later, step back from that tradition, faced with many others that surround us, and we have to ask the question, is this what I want to do, and why is it that I'm doing what I'm doing? And our choices, maybe for a long time in the West, have been between secular and religious perspectives, partly because we lived in relatively religiously homogeneous spaces. Now they're increasingly not just between secular and religious, they're among the multiple faiths, the choices that we have to make that vie for our allegiance and our interest. It may also be that these are the choices between meaning and sometimes also meaninglessness, because that too is on the offer. The types of philosophies that would call into question the entirety of the endeavor, but that too, right, is an engagement with the question of the good life, even when the response is, no, there is no such a thing as true life. No, there's no such a thing as a good life. You're imagining these things or you're construing it for yourself, but ultimately that can be deconstructed. Now, so the point that I was making so far is the question of true life, good life, life worth living is a question that historically has engaged religions and philosophies. It's a fundamental rather than marginal question, and it is particularly pressing question for us today. Now, the next point that I wish to make is that the question is pressing, but that we are increasingly unable and ill-equipped to answer that question or even to engage that question. And there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is our lives are simply too crowded, it seems like, or at least that's how we think. I remember I was doing a doctoral work, I think it was in the 80s, and there were some sociological studies how within foreseeable future, technological developments will be such that they would reduce our work hour from some 40 hours a week to about 20 or even 15, and with the rest of this time we can do as Karl Marx has dreamed in his German ideology. We go fishing, we go theorizing in the afternoon, and then do a little bit of music, and then we do a little bit of work as well, and our lives are be such that we'll be kind of freed to pursue kinds of issues of depth that we as human beings are well advised to pursue. As it turned out, our lives are now busier than they have ever been, and more development there is, the more stuff for us there is to do. And if we are not working around the clock, we are entertaining ourselves around the clock, and there are plenty of distractions. We don't have even space, even when we have maybe a little bit of space or time, we don't have a sufficient attention span. Our attention span has shrunk that we can't engage it in a proper way. As I'll mention toward the end, I teach together with a group of colleagues of mine. I teach at Yale a class called Life Worth Living. And it is a class about exactly this kind of question. At many universities, they're very popular classes that help you to lead your life well. Like Stanford has a Design Your Life course. At Yale is a very popular course right now, Psychology and the Good Life, which is about positive psychology and what kind of contribution it can bring to life being lived better. All very good. What they don't do, these courses, is to ask you. They presume that you know how it is that you should live your life, and they try to help you how to get from point A to point B. The course that we are teaching is about how do you choose, how do you discern what kind of life you should live. Not how do you get what you desire, but what is desirable, what you ought to desire in your life. And as we are teaching this course, I'll say maybe a few more words at the end about it. students somewhere in the middle would often make a comment. Wait a second. These people have been taught, these traditions have been engaging this question for 3,000 plus years. And I'm supposed to make a decision in the course of one afternoon, maybe revision tomorrow or something of that sort. Suddenly they realize that this is not just an important question, but that it requires a certain kinds of skills and attentiveness, which, given the crowded lives that we lead, seem not to be available to us. And so what we tend to do is we kind of trust our gut feeling. We look at what our neighbors do, trust our gut feelings, and then we consult texts that may be described as kind of life project equivalent to consumer reports, right? To see how this thing will work, right? And see a little bit, and then between the consumer reports about living life well and your gut feeling, you kind of make a decision and you remake it as you're meandering through this. Question is simply we don't devote enough time, partly because our lives are crowded. I think there is probably more important reason why we don't engage that question, and that reason is, I mean, we can name others. I'll concentrate on what I think is the most important one, and that is that we have, in the process of modernity, what some philosophers have called privatized the question of the good life. It has become our individual private question. It is no longer a public question or a shared question, partly because we live in pluralistic societies and we can't quite agree publicly of what the good life is, and therefore there's this move toward privatization of that question. But it's not just that it's private, that it's yours to decide in some ways, right? But it's also that we have come to advocate what Charles Taylor has described as ethics of authenticity, which is to say we answer this question. It's not that it's our private question, and that's why we don't debate it very much, that we kind of negotiate it with ourselves, but we don't answer it through arguments, but we look inside and look at the nature of who our inner self is, recognizing what our true self is. Then we try to be faithful to this true self of ours, so that each of us, we have come to think, has inscribed in our own very being, in the depths of our being, if we're just attentive enough, what our true life ought to be, and that's what we need to discern. So you always, even so, when say people come to ask us for advice, what do we tell them? We maybe give them a little bit of advice, but we always ask, but just make sure to follow your dream, right? Following your dream is really what the life, true life, what good life is truly all about. And I was thinking about how then folks like philosophers or religious scholars, or not just religious scholars, but priests or rabbis, what their role in this process is. And you can maybe contrast it, say something like this. Whereas in an earlier age, a philosopher or a priest might function, a theologian, priest might function as a nutritionist of your life. They'll kind of tell you what your life needs to have if it's going to be a healthy, good, true, authentic life, right? So they would kind of describe it for you, and what kind of food do you need to take so that you can lead a healthy spiritual life or lead a good life. And I think the philosophers or religious scholars and priests have now become more like waiters. Now they tell you what's on menu, and they'll describe to you what each of the dishes is, and then they'll say, but kind of it's your choice to do. If you ask them about, they'll tell you, oh, I've tried this, I like it, but it's your choice, right? You need to decide exactly what you're going to take, and they'll never evaluate them for you, right? They'll tell them they're all equally good provided you like them. Because the only criterion of the successful meal for a waiter is that a customer has gone satisfied, they're going to return back, and they have gotten what they have wanted, right? So from a nutritionist, you turn into something like folks like me turn into something like waiters. They provide information, maybe, for a decision that has to be very personally made, tailor-made. Now, I don't disagree that each of our lives has peculiarities, that we are individuals, that each of us are unique, so that whatever life we choose, even we choose in the tradition, which I prefer to think in those terms, and I will try to make an argument for that as well a little bit later on, that it shouldn't have a kind of be specifically tailored to you. Each of us is a human being, kind of generic human being, but each of us is also a very specific human being for in a specific time, specific place, and therefore every good life is led specifically in a particular way. This doesn't mean, from my perspective, that all lives are equally good. Even though they may be true to who person perceives oneself to be. Now, what we have then turned out to do in the public realm, because we can't agree on the visions of the good life, what we do agree is what kind of resources you need in order to follow your dream. Right? You need to have a certain economic resources. You need to have certain knowledge resources. You need to have certain relational resources. And so then educational system and others, I'll talk about it a little bit later on, they become about creating resources that you can have so as to lead the life as you see fit, that fits to your in your dreams. Now, we can understand also why that might be going on, right? But interesting thing happens. First, those are resources or a means, not an end, right? But interesting thing happens is that slowly and gradually, means become ends. Most clear case of that is money. Money is a pure means, right? You can't live off of it. It can help you to live, right? It can provide things that you, but there are people who live for the increase of money, right? The same can be true for knowledge and so forth. So you've got then the means to life that turn into ends of life. And now when that happens, I think the dog is chasing its tail, right? And it's going to be spinning and spinning around because there's no end to it. And especially, there's no end to it in a competitive environment in which we often work to get the means. And they end up being, resources end up giving certain status to us, certain social status. We compare each other, and suddenly they have shifted in becoming a means, becoming ends. One of the sociologists that I was reading on this issue, Hartmut Rosa, is a German sociologist. He has compared what we do in contemporary societies with a painter who is all busy about getting his studio or her studio in proper order, having all the necessary tool, making sure that all the paints are there. He's or she is fussing around about making sure that everything that is needed for the paint job of painting, that everything is there, but he or she never gets to paint because they're so concerned about how the shape of those conditions for painting, resources that he needs or she needs for painting, are available there. pretty much the whole then sense of self becomes in comparison what kind of studios and what kind of address of studio I have, but not in the act of really painting. And good chunk, I think, of our lives are spent doing just these kinds of things. Now, so that's kind of one problem with this idea of leaving the ends to each individual's sense of authenticity and concentrating on means. Now, the other problem is with the way then in which we end up choosing our ends. And often, if you think about you choosing your ends, we are then being the persons who affirm or assert value for the particular way of life. We designed it for ourselves. We craft it as meaningful. And when we craft something as meaningful, to whatever we give meaning, we can take the meaning away. The meaning, I think, depends, and maybe that's something for discussion for us, it depends on the kind of stability of the value of that which we are pursuing. And in addition, I think what happens is that we become relatively incapable of public debate about the ends and goals that we are pursuing. In fact, we have defined those goods as such that public debate cannot be carried on. And that's, I think, a deep problem. It's a deep problem because I think those goods, whether we are aware or not, they actually shape the way in which we live. And that seems to me has to be surfaced, and we need to learn the way, how to reflect on what it means for life to be good, for life to be true, for life to be worth living, and so on. Now, so I've said it's an important question, central question. It's a pressing question for us. We are ill-equipped, increasingly ill-equipped to address this question. And now the question is, well, where do we find some help in order to get ourselves out of this, what I think is a true crisis. It's not named as crisis, but I believe that's one of the major crises of our time. Now, you might think that educational institutions, that universities, for instance, would be places where you would go in order to get this question addressed. But if you follow analysis of some folks who write about shifts in the character of university and college cultures and nature of college educational and university educational endeavors, then you'll see that increasingly colleges and universities are kind of giving up on that question. A colleague of mine from the law school, Anthony Kronman, has written a book entitled Education's End, on why American colleges and universities have given up on the meaning of life. Maybe that title is a bit more dramatic than actual state of affairs is there, but he notes a very important trend, and I'll take only one strand of what he's describing, and that is that the colleges and universities have increasingly become work of scholars have become modeled on hard sciences. Closer and closer to those hard sciences, I would add to this, concerned with instrumental rationality, concerned with kinds of things that we need to negotiate life from point A to point B, precisely the kinds of things that we need in order to create resources, in order to be able to then pursue personal kind of dream that we have. And often, that's what you hear in colleges, right? Universities will give you resources so you can live the life as you deem fit. And that seems like a very nice and good thing for college to do, except that it betrays its traditional one of the key traditional responsibilities. If you take the intellectual culture going all the way to Greeks, all the way straight through the 60s, 70s of the last century, at the center of university education, not necessarily what was mostly done, but at the center of university education was the question of a good and meaningful life. You can put it this way. At universities, we have become expert in means, but amateurs in ends, in goals. We know how to get from point A to point B, and we know how to do it increasingly well. But who's helping us think what's truly worth driving, the place where it's truly worth driving? And if we keep the goals of our lives opaque to reason, to understanding, to insight, to wisdom, whichever term you want to use for that, imagine universities are at service of our gut feelings and consultation of consumer reports and decisions that we are making. It would be a pretty sad state of affairs. I think universities, just like I think other institutions, have to be about more than just resources. And please don't hear it as a statement that we shouldn't be also about resources. I know that I would be chased off this campus. If you're, those of you who are college students, if your parents heard me talk about that colleges shouldn't be about resources, right? Because why are we paying all this money so that you can go to college if you're not going to be able to get a job after you graduate, right? Of course, that's also what universities are and colleges are about, but they are, I think, fundamentally also about question of the purposes of our lives. Now, Anthony Kroman, whom I've mentioned, he's relatively pessimistic about colleges, partly because they're under pressure from various sources in order to deliver better kind of instrumental better helps to generate better resources for our lives. He said, well, today, if you want to go to a place, if you want to name an institution where these discussions are taking place, he said, well, you have to go to religious institutions. And that sounds good, especially as coming from somebody who, for a while, thought of himself when he was writing as an agnostic. Right? So he realized that in some of the religious traditions, that's an important question that's being pursued. Except, I told him, Tony, when have you been last time to a church? And of course, he hasn't been to too many churches. And I don't want to be too harsh about churches, but I'll tell you what I observe. The tendency in churches as well or tendency in religious traditions. You can put it more. I can put it more broadly. Is to see faith. I'll use two phrases: as performance-enhancing drug, or as divine band-aid. But performance-enhancing drug, I think, well, you come in the critical situation, you somehow need something to succeed there, right? As when you're in a sporting event, right, and you're a goalie and there's a penalty kick in soccer, right? And then you cross yourself with whatever hand you have and say whatever prayer you can think of, because you need this extra little bit of help in order to achieve this important goal to you. It's kind of a performance-enhancing drug when it works, right? And I'm sometimes praying for God not to answer those prayers, because it would be kind of crazy if God did, right? Or kind of divine band-aid. You go through life, it's very difficult in life, you stumble, you scrape yourself, you kind of need to be put together again. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not opposed to something like performance-enhancing and drugs in religious terms, kind of help in life that we need in order to act in a kind of critical situations. I'm not opposed to something like a redemptive blessing. Obviously, I pray for that, and it's not an issue. But when that becomes the major focus, rather than how our lives are being shaped, then I think Christian faith has kind of gotten shortchanged here. I was once, recently, I was sitting with a group of men, and we were kind of discussing what we do for private devotions. And then one of the guys said something that a lot of people resonated with. Well, in the morning he does a little bit of exercise, stretching. He was a kind of high power businessman, and then he reads Oswald Chambers and the Bible, and then he goes and does his work, right? There was no sense that what was written in Oswald Chambers was what was read there or in the Bible will in any way shape what he was doing for 12 hours when he was in the job. It functioned more like a meditation does, right? Kind of centering us, giving us a sense of peace with who we are, so that we can perform the tasks in hand. And I understand why he might have thought that way, because it's very hard in the environment in which we are to kind of have your life be shaped by profoundly Christian values, or you can put it more abstractly, to align your life, the true purpose of your life, in daily jobs that you have. So that's kind of ends up being a challenge. So my ending of my lecture here is to urge us as members of religious communities, but also as students and faculty in educational institutions, to take up the question of flourishing life, of true life, of the good life, and take it up in a particular forum. I'll address the forum a little bit tomorrow, but I'll say only a few words before I end. The course that I'm going to teach at Yale, and otherwise when I speak about those issues, I always speak and describe these conversations and pursuit of this question as a truth-seeking conversation. It's not that you have various options of true life or flourishing life before you, and they're sitting like flavors of ice cream in an ice cream shop. And then you walk by and you say, you know, today I feel like chocolate. Strawberries are not quite my thing here. I'll combine different chocolate, and then I put some toppings on this thing. This will be my flavor of the day, maybe of the week. And then tomorrow I'll choose something else. You combine whatever I want. These are appealing to our tastes. But I think religious traditions, great philosophies, do not appeal simply to our tastes. They appeal to our sense of what is true. What is true in a more profound sense than that 2 and 2 are 4. That's true in more profound sense that maybe truths of physics or chemistry or biology are true in a slightly different sense also, but nonetheless, that is true in a significant and I think existentially most important sense of the term. Therefore, truth-seeking conversations about most important questions of our lives through truth-seeking, if you're doing it on your own, is one of the fundamental tasks that we have, and I hope that we would learn how to engage it in our educational institutions, because I think it will come, and religious institutions, but because I think it will come to our good, both as individuals, and tomorrow I'll make argument, they'll come to our good as societies as a whole. Now, I think I've talked for about some 43 minutes, and I will stop here. I think you ought to have opportunity to protest, at least, maybe ask a question if you feel like it. So let the question and answer session, comment question, be initiated by this comment of mine. So. Yes?
So on your last point, you are addressing the matter of truth and finding a personal truth, if my understanding is correct. And the idea of religious tradition is often a foundation of where that starts. So for people who do not have a religious tradition or background or influence, in what ways do they approach the finding truth and meaning of life in the same way without a religious tradition? And so I guess I think of hybrid religions also when you're talking about mixing different flavors and finding what people like versus a singular tradition.
Right. Great question. I do think that there are secular accounts of the true life. I think most that I know, some of them could come in that secular, some of them quite not can be combined with religious, but normally are secular. Say, take utilitarianism. It makes truth claims, not just on it's not a personal. It's a truth claim about what, maybe not so much a truth claim of what a good life is and what the responsible moral stance in life is. It happens that in utilitarianism the two don't fit together. They kind of there's a big gap between the two by design, right? But nonetheless, and it's not just for a particular person. It's true for every human being. If you would ask Karl Marx, he had a vision of true life. He thought it was applied to every human being. If you ask Nietzsche, he had a vision, and it applied also to every human being. This course that we teach includes both religious and non-religious traditions and accounts of the good life. And basically I introduce it to the students by saying, listen, they all claim to be true. And we can discuss what exactly it means there, right? But they claim to be true. If they claim to be true, they're not claiming to be true only for original readers or a particular group of people who have a fancy for listening to what they're saying and embracing it as their personal truth. They mean that they're true for every human being, which means when we read their text, they're talking about your life. They're talking about my life. Now, they may be completely wrong about what they're saying, but they're making a truth claim. And therefore, we need to, in this class, basically I tell students, in this class we will engage them at the level at which they make their claims. You may think they're wrong, but tell me why do you think they're wrong. Don't simply say, oh, this is just a flavor of ice cream. Engage it as a truth claim. And so whether it's secular or whether it's religious, your life is at stake. And your life not just right now, your life broadly. Now, you mentioned also kind of bricolaged religions, right? Sometimes 2, 3 elements are included, and it's happening. So it can have a various forms, bricolage. Often there is something else, kind of soft relativism, which is, by the way, also a way of life. It can be unthoughtfully embraced, but it's a moral ideal. Soft relativism of bricolaging, and which then you simply move whichever way you want with certain moral convictions about who you are, what social good is, what moral commitments you have. They're all in play. People just don't thematize them. And then you draw from different traditions and make the thing work as you deem fit. So that would be one option. The other option is you are in a particular religious tradition, and you find something in another religious traditions that you find enriching. Indeed, I have often found these things, and you incorporate it in your own account of what your tradition is. And I don't think that would be unusual. The religious traditions have always learned in mutual engagement with one another. Sometimes they've done it in a chagrined kind of a way, Sometimes they've done it in a way unconscious that they're doing it. Sometimes they've done it in opposing the other tradition, but nonetheless incorporating, right? Not necessarily aware of what's going on, but that's been always, I think, going on.
I don't know how much I buy your story about the sort of retreat from normative reasoning. Just looking at the sort of historical time scale, I don't know how much we're supposed to think that in the distant past that people wealthy and impoverished were in their daily lives considering what their like ultimate moral ends were and orienting themselves toward that. And I don't know if I really think that there's been any radical change across time in how we orient ourselves toward or not toward these ends. I think that in a more plural society, obviously there's a wider variety of ends people embrace, and maybe people don't seem to be following the ends that they embrace, but I think that that's basically always how things have been. I don't see any evidence in the historical record that things were at some point different. Even on the question of what the academy looks like, the non-normatively concerned professions have grown, certainly, but I think the academy has also simply grown, and so I don't think the like absolute level of work being done on these normative questions has changed or reduced, just that its share in what we think of as the new expanded academy might be smaller. But if we reduce what the academy is to sort of the humanities, which the academy used to be, I think things look mostly the same. And I'm also worried that to some extent, so like, there is a tacit relativism in the society. I think some of that relativism may be embraced wholeheartedly, that it's an earnest assertion of relativism rather than a sort of relaxation toward relativism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the last point, I hope that I made a similar point in the, at least in the answer to the question, because I think that's correct. You know, I buy Charles Taylor's analysis in Ethics of Authenticity that what sometimes look like individualism and associated with individualism is relativism actually is a moral ideal. That people embrace. It's not a simply a kind of absence of. It's not a kind of classical sturdy relativism as a philosophical position that we all think is not compelling. Right? So I fully agree with you on this. On the changes in education itself, I'm not sure that I agree actually. I think so. One part of the story, the one that I told, concerns kind of predominance of natural sciences and kind of instrumental reason. I think the other side concerns also what has happened to the humanities. So that generally humanities scholars, if I'm not mistaken, they in humanities across the board, closer you come to the ideal of objectivity, the more like the model of rationality that seems tacitly operative, closer you are to the model of rationality that is tacitly operative, which is rationality of natural sciences. And so you become a historian of religion. You become a phenomenologist of religion. You try to engage in the descriptive mode of action. Now, that's also not the entirety of the humanities. I think one of the things that, again, we're talking about trends rather than absence or absolute absence of presence. But also another trend that I think is very significant that goes in opposite direction, where I think the big questions of life need to be present, and it's the predominance of the critique as a mode of engagement. It's, and the critique, by critique I mean a kind of exercise that sees one of the main reasons for reading the classical text, or one of the main modes of reading classical text, as a kind of suspicion, nurturing suspicion against power relations that were in play in particular forms of text, and so they end up. It ends up becoming more of a detective work, critique work of the larger traditions as well as of contemporary structures, but very little desire or ability actually to posit something positively. And that brings me to the next point that I think is very important in this discussion, and that is that there is a widespread sensibility that everything positive that you assert is exclusionary. So if I assert something as a true way of life, I'm excluding somebody from this, and by the sheer fact of assertion of that, I'm pushing, I'm kind of undermining at least the other person. Now, I'm sure that there are ways of stating positive things that do just that, right? But I'm also sure that one, without a positive thing, we cannot actually function as human beings, and that there are ways of asserting positive that would not do the kind of damage that we sometimes know that religious traditions, other traditions are doing in the process of asserting the positive ideals. And part of the push that I'm making is to kind of counter this dominance, either of descriptive moment in humanities, or predominance of critique. And I'm not the only one. There are others who are doing the same thing in favor of affirmation of something positive. And I'll just add very briefly this. My sense is not that descriptions are not important. To the contrary, I believe they're really important at getting them right. My point is also not that critique is not important. Getting the right critique is a very important. It's a secondary task, though. It cannot be primary task. And I bring it to make it concrete for myself, very simple. I have a 3-month-old daughter. What should I teach her about what the good life is? I can't be negative. I can't simply tell her not, no. And I will structure, by the way in which I act, I will structure a positive vision for her. What the life is into which I'm hoping that she will grow while having sufficient freedom to say at some point, Dad, this is really not quite what I want. I would like to, become an atheist or whatever a person might decide. But this kind of sense of positive is a condition of possibility of us living humane lives. And it's not enough, and this is the last point I'll say it's in response to you, and it's not enough for us simply to have a positive as operative. Because we need to have reflexive engagement with the positive. Because who ends up shaping our positive vision? Advertisement does, comparisons with other folks do. We suddenly become surrounded by certain implicit visions that become our own without truly having made them our own through the reflective process. And so the argument or the plea is, let's reflect on those. But in order to reflect on those, the important resources for reflection are found in the great religious and secular traditions.
We are out of time.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, 2 questions, it was too long of an answers, but you asked very good questions, and so I have to give long answers.
Well, join me in thanking Professor Volf.